There is exactly one thing a narcissist can do that means they are never, ever coming back. Not the affair, not the cruel words said in the heat of an argument, not even the public humiliation that felt at the time like the worst thing they could possibly do to you. Those things feel like endings. They rarely are. What actually ends it, permanently, structurally, with no cycle of discard and return waiting on the other side, is something far quieter and far harder to spot while it's happening. If you've ever loved a narcissist, you already know how many final straws turned out not to be final at all. You've probably lived through the blow-up that felt unforgivable, followed weeks or months later by a message that somehow, against everything you knew to be true, still made your chest tighten. You've watched them do things that should have ended it forever, and then watched the whole cycle start right back up again, almost as if nothing happened. This is confusing precisely because you're looking for the ending in the wrong place. You're looking at what they did to you. The real ending isn't found there. It's found in what they found somewhere else. Let's talk about why the obvious final straws almost never actually work, because understanding this is the key to understanding what does. A narcissist's relationship with you was never primarily about you specifically. It was about what you provided. Admiration, attention, emotional reactivity, the constant, reliable confirmation that they matter and that they still have the power to affect someone deeply. This is what psychologists refer to as narcissistic supply, and it's the actual currency the entire relationship runs on, whether either of you ever named it that way out loud. Here's the crucial detail almost nobody explains clearly enough. An affair doesn't end the supply chain. Neither does cruelty, humiliation, or betrayal, no matter how devastating those things are to experience. In fact, all three of those events often function, from the narcissist side, as ways of generating even more supply. Your devastated reaction to the affair, your hurt at the cruel words, your humiliation being witnessed by other people, all of it is still, in its own painful way, proof that you're deeply invested in them. A narcissist can run on that proof for a remarkably long time. Some run on it for years, cycling through the same pattern of harm and reconciliation, precisely because your pain, however unbearable it is for you, is still something they can use. So if none of the dramatic, obvious things actually end it, what does? The one thing that reliably, permanently ends a narcissist's investment in you is this. They find someone else who can fully replace the specific function you were serving in a way that requires less effort to maintain than the relationship with you had come to require. This sounds almost insultingly simple when you say it plainly, but it explains nearly every pattern that confuses people trying to understand narcissistic behavior from the outside. It explains why some exes disappear completely and never resurface, while others hoover back in periodically for years. It explains why the timing of a permanent disappearance so rarely lines up with anything you did, because it was never about anything you did. It was about whether a suitable replacement had been found yet. Here's what makes this genuinely rare and why so many relationships with narcissists cycle on for far longer than anyone watching from the outside can understand. Finding someone who can fully replace what you provided isn't as simple as finding someone new to date. It requires finding someone who offers a very specific, very demanding combination. Enough admiration to feed the need for validation, enough tolerance to absorb the narcissist's worst behavior without leaving, and this is the part that's hardest to replicate, enough naivety about the pattern to not yet recognize what's happening. Because once someone recognizes the pattern clearly, as you likely eventually did, their tolerance for it starts eroding fast. This is why so many narcissists keep multiple sources of supply running simultaneously, even while appearing committed to one primary relationship. It's not because they're incapable of monogamy in the simple sense people usually mean. It's because a single, fully dependent upon source of supply is a vulnerability. If that one source becomes unavailable through growing wise to the pattern, through setting boundaries, through simply getting exhausted past the point of continuing, the narcissist needs somewhere else to redirect immediately, because sitting in the absence of supply, even briefly, is one of the most uncomfortable states their psychology is built to avoid. This is also the moment worth sitting with for a second because it explains something that confuses almost everyone who's lived through this. Why the discard sometimes seems to come out of nowhere with no warning, no argument, no identifiable trigger you can point back to. You'll be going through your normal cycle, some tension, some distance, then reconciliation, the same pattern you've weathered a dozen times before. And then suddenly, without the usual dramatic buildup, they're just gone, cold, uninterested, on to someone else with a speed that feels almost surreal given how much history the two of you supposedly shared. That abruptness isn't a sign that something uniquely terrible happened this time. It's a sign that the replacement was already in motion before the discard ever became visible to you. By the time you notice the ending, the actual decision was usually made weeks or months earlier, quietly, somewhere you had no access to. This is also why trying to prevent the ending by being a better partner almost never works the way people hope it will. If you've ever found yourself in the aftermath of a fight, working harder, giving more, trying to become more agreeable, more understanding, more available in some unconscious attempt to make yourself irreplaceable, I want you to understand something important. That effort was never actually competing with the right thing. You were trying to outperform a standard of loyalty and understanding you'd already met, sometimes many times over. What you can't compete with is novelty. You cannot outgive someone who hasn't yet learned what giving costs when it's met with contempt. You cannot outadmire someone who hasn't yet run out of admiration to offer because they haven't been in the relationship long enough for the admiration to be tested. The competition was never actually fair, and understanding that isn't a failure on your part. It's simply the mechanics of what supply requires. Freshness above almost everything else. Here's what makes this even more disorienting if you're currently living through it. Because the actual cause of the ending is invisible to you, you'll instinctively search for a cause you can see. You'll comb back through the last weeks or months, looking for the fight that finally broke something, the comment that finally pushed them too far, some identifiable failure on your part that explains the sudden silence. Most of the time, there isn't one. The ending wasn't caused by something you did wrong. It was caused by something that had nothing to do with you at all, a timeline running in the background, invisible from where you were standing, that simply reached its conclusion the moment a viable replacement became available. Here's what that replacement actually looks like from the outside, and it's almost never what you'd expect based on how devastating it feels in the moment you first notice it happening. It doesn't usually look dramatic. It rarely announces itself as a grand romantic gesture or an obvious, defiant new relationship flaunted specifically to hurt you. Most of the time, it looks disturbingly ordinary. A new person who seems on the surface unremarkable, someone who wouldn't stand out in a crowd or seem like a threat to what you had. And that ordinariness is actually the point, because what makes someone a viable replacement has almost nothing to do with how special or exceptional they are. It has everything to do with where they are in their own journey of understanding what they're dealing with. This is the detail that explains so much of the confusion and pain that comes with watching a narcissist move on quickly to someone new. You spent months or years learning the pattern, noticing the incongruence, recognizing the love bombing for what it was, developing boundaries that eventually made you harder to manipulate the way you once were. The new person hasn't done any of that work yet. They're standing exactly where you stood at the very beginning, dazzled by an intensity of attention that feels like destiny, completely unaware that the same performance has been run before, successfully, on someone else who is now watching from a distance, with knowledge the new person doesn't have access to. This is why it can feel so viscerally unfair watching this unfold, because it is, in a very real sense, unfair. The new person isn't smarter than you were, isn't more special, isn't offering something you couldn't have offered. They're simply earlier in the timeline. They haven't yet lived through enough repetitions of the pattern to recognize it, which means for now, they can offer the narcissist something you no longer can. Fresh, uncomplicated admiration, untainted by the accumulated evidence you were carrying by the time things ended. But here's what almost nobody tells you about this specific kind of replacement, and it's the piece that matters most if you're currently watching it happen and wondering what it means about your own worth. The fact that they were replaceable to a narcissist was never a reflection of how replaceable you actually are, in any real human sense. A narcissist doesn't need a partner who is genuinely irreplaceable. They need a partner who can perform a specific narrow function, and that function can be filled, at least temporarily, by nearly anyone who hasn't yet learned to see through the performance. This isn't a statement about your value. It's a statement about how low the bar actually is for what a narcissist requires from the people they keep close, and how little that requirement has to do with who those people genuinely are underneath the role they're being asked to play. This is also why the relationship that replaces you almost never lasts as long or runs as deep as the one it replaced, something that offers little comfort in the immediate aftermath but matters enormously over time. Because the new person is starting from zero in every sense that counts. They don't have your years of conditioning, your learned fluency in de-escalating the narcissist's specific patterns, your deeply practiced instinct for absorbing friction before it reaches anyone else, which means the new relationship, however dazzling it looks in its opening months, is built on a foundation far weaker than the one it's replacing. And foundations like that tend to crack faster under less pressure than anyone watching from the outside expects. There's another layer to this worth understanding clearly, because it changes how you interpret what you might be seeing on social media, through mutual friends, or in your own imagination, running ahead of the actual facts. A narcissist showcasing a new relationship in its early stages isn't showing you evidence of a healthier, more successful version of what you had. They're showing you the only part of any relationship with them that ever reliably works. The opening act, the love bombing phase, the golden period, the stretch of time before enough friction has accumulated to reveal the pattern underneath. You lived through that same opening act once. It felt real to you too at the time, because in its own limited way it was real. Narcissists are often genuinely capable of that initial intensity, even if they're incapable of sustaining anything built to last beyond it. What you're seeing now isn't proof that this version is different. It's proof that you're watching the same first act of a play whose second and third acts you've already sat through. This is important because so much of the pain in watching a replacement unfold comes from an unspoken assumption that this new relationship must be succeeding where yours failed, that somehow, this time, things are different, easier, healthier, because the narcissist finally found the right person. That assumption almost never holds up under scrutiny, even though you may never get to see the evidence that disproves it. Relationships that run on freshness rather than genuine compatibility have a built-in expiration date, even when that expiration date takes longer to arrive than either person expects. The absence of visible conflict in the early months isn't the absence of the underlying pattern. It's simply the pattern not having had enough time yet to surface. This is where the actual ending, the permanent one, the one this entire story has been building toward, reveals its final, most important layer. Because finding a replacement doesn't just end things with you, it sets the entire cycle running again on a compressed timeline with someone who will eventually, inevitably, arrive at the same recognition you did. And when that happens, when the new person starts setting boundaries, starts noticing the incongruence, starts becoming, in other words, exactly the kind of partner who's no longer useful as supply, the narcissist will need another replacement, and another after that. The permanence you're looking for, from your specific vantage point, was never actually permanence in any larger sense. It was simply your particular turn in a cycle that keeps running, with different names attached, indefinitely. Understanding this doesn't erase the pain of having been the one who was replaced. It shouldn't have to, and I'm not going to pretend it does. But it does something almost as important. It reframes what happened from a verdict about your worth into an accurate description of a mechanism that was never about worth in the first place. You were not measured against this new person and found lacking. You were simply further along a timeline they hadn't reached yet. A timeline that, given enough time in the relationship, they are very likely to reach too, whether or not you're ever there to witness it happening. Which means the real question was never actually what would make them 100% done with me forever. That question, as devastating as it feels to sit inside, was always slightly the wrong one because it keeps your attention fixed on their behavior, their choices, their timeline, as though your worth or your peace depended on correctly predicting when their supply chain would finally permanently exclude you. The real question, the one that actually changes something, is entirely different. What would it take for you to become permanently unavailable as supply, regardless of what they do or who they find next? Because here's the truth underneath everything we've walked through in this story. You don't actually need them to be done with you in order to be free of them. That's the reversal almost nobody explains clearly enough, and it's the one that matters most if you're still in some quiet corner of yourself waiting for confirmation that this time finally it's really over. You don't need their permanent absence to build your own permanent peace. You need your own boundaries, your own clarity, your own refusal to keep offering the specific things that make you useful to someone who was never going to use them for anything but their own comfort. This is why the empaths who heal most completely from this dynamic are rarely the ones who spend years tracking whether the narcissist has moved on for good, parsing social media for clues, asking mutual friends for updates that only reopen the wound each time. They're the ones who stopped needing that information altogether, who reached a point where the narcissist's current relationship status, their apparent happiness or misery, their silence or their sudden resurfacing simply stopped being relevant to how they were living their own life. That shift doesn't happen because the narcissist finally proved something. It happens because the person healing stopped waiting for that proof. And here's what's genuinely worth understanding about the replacement once you can see it clearly instead of through the lens of rejection. The new person filling that role isn't living some enviable, secure version of what you had. They're standing at the very beginning of a story you already know the middle and end of. The dazzling opening months, the sense of being uniquely chosen, the intensity that feels like nothing they've ever experienced before. All of it is the same opening act you once lived through yourself, and it carries within it every seed of the same slow erosion that eventually led you here, listening to this, having survived it. You're not watching someone win something you lost. You're watching someone begin a journey whose ending you've already lived and whose lessons you already carry, whether or not they ever get the chance to learn them for themselves. There's a particular kind of freedom available in this reframe that's worth sitting with for a moment because it's easy to rush past it in the pursuit of feeling better faster. You do not have to root for the new relationship to fail in order to find peace with what happened to you. You don't have to hope they get exactly what they gave you. Don't have to wait for karma to arrive in a form dramatic enough to feel satisfying. You can hold something quieter and, in the long run, far more sustainable. The simple, grounded understanding that the pattern will very likely repeat, not because you wish it on anyone, but because patterns like this one repeat by their very nature, absent the kind of deep, sustained internal work most narcissists never choose to do. That understanding doesn't require your hope or your anger to be true. It just is what it is, independent of anything you feel about it. If you're waiting for the moment a narcissist becomes 100% done with you, permanently, undeniably, in a way that finally lets you exhale, I want you to consider the possibility that the moment you're actually waiting for isn't theirs to deliver at all. It's yours. It arrives the day you stop needing their absence to be permanent in order to feel like your presence in your own life is real, whole, and no longer up for negotiation with someone who was never capable of negotiating fairly in the first place. They may find someone new, they may not, they may cycle back around in 6 months or 2 years, testing whether the door is still as firmly shut as it feels right now. None of that actually determines whether you're free. What determines that is something entirely within your own reach, something that doesn't require their cooperation, their clarity, or their permanent verified absence from your life in order to become true. You become done with needing them to be done with you. That sentence is worth reading twice because it holds the entire shift this story has been building toward. Not, they finally moved on for good, so now I can rest. But I stopped needing to know whether they moved on for good, and in that not needing, I found the rest I was actually looking for all along. The first version keeps your peace hostage to information you may never actually receive with certainty. The second version hands your peace back to you entirely, regardless of what they do next, regardless of whether you ever get confirmation, regardless of whether the silence that follows is real or just another pause before the cycle starts again. Thanks for watching. Take care.